in today's discourse, we're actually talking about socialism versus capitalism. How can we even be talking about that? It just completely blows me out. I had the unfortunate experience to stand at the wall, the Berlin Wall, and see people shot down in cold blood. Not because they were trying to escape to communism. It is now my pleasure, in fact honor, to introduce Colonel Bob Patrick, the U.S. Army retired. He is former director of the Veterans History Project at the Library of Congress. He was director of the National World War II Memorial Commission and directed the historic dedication of the World War II Memorial in 2004. He's a graduate of the Virginia Military Institute, VMI, and he will introduce to you a couple of folks that I've gotten to know, and you're going to hear some stories that I think will equally as move you. So, with no further ado, Colonel Patrick.
Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be here this afternoon. I will tell you right up front, when I was asked to do this panel, I didn't know who Rescorla was. And I did a little reference on this. So just, you know ahead of time who we're talking about today. Colonel Rick Rescorla was an Englishman from Cornwall, a soldier in Rhodesia, a decorated Vietnam veteran, a playwright, a teacher, a singer, a romantic husband, a ballroom dancer, a film buff, a cancer survivor, and a security expert who on the last day of his life, September 11th, 2001, performed the heroic act of saving over 2,000 lives of people at the World Trade Center. Today we have three gentlemen who are going to talk about Colonel Rescorla from different aspects. First we have Mr. Joe Galloway on your left. Joe is a famed war correspondent who was in Vietnam in 1965. He co-authored the acclaimed book, We Were Soldiers Once and Young, I Drang, The Battle That Changed the War in Vietnam. Lieutenant Rick Rescorla was a platoon leader in the Battle of I Drang. Bill Van Scoyoc was employed by Morgan Stanley and was working in Tower 2 of the World Trade Center on September 11, 2001. He led the evacuation of 276 employees and witnessed the valor of Rescorla. Bill McMahon, a regional director at Morgan Stanley, was working on the 69th floor of the World Trade Center on September 11, 2001. I would like to start with Mr. Galloway. Joe, could you give us a little bit of background on the Battle of I Drang and what you know about Lieutenant Rick Rescorla?
The I Drang battles, two of them, one right after the other, resulted in over 300 Americans killed in action, about 500 wounded. Turns out that the first major battle between American regulars and North Vietnamese regulars was the bloodiest battle of the entire 10-year war, and it happened in the very beginning. 1st Cavalry Division, Air Mobile, introducing helicopter warfare. The North Vietnamese sent regulars down in division strength, and they collided head-on in a very remote valley in the central highlands of Vietnam. And Colonel Hal Moore had his 1st Battalion, 7th U.S. Cavalry, took them into the valley, into a landing zone about the size of a football field. And promptly we were surrounded by 2 regiments of North Vietnamese regulars. Cliffhanger battle. On the first day, his Charlie company was virtually destroyed, 65% casualties in a matter of one afternoon. So he was calling for reinforcements, and B Company of the 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry was sent in. One of the platoon leaders was Lieutenant Rick Rescorla, big, burly, curly-headed Englishman from Cornwall, a real firecracker of an officer and a leader. He occupied this position that had been virtually overrun, immediately put his men to work deepening the foxholes, building firing steps, had them go out and stomp down the elephant grass and clear fields of fire, put out booby traps to alert them, because he was sure that there would be attacks coming, and so there were that night 3 separate battalion-size enemy attacks against that company's section of the line. 3 o'clock in the morning, waiting for that first attack. It's a very low point when you're on 100% alert. And he knew his guys were nervous, and he sang to them. He sang them the old British Army songs of the Zulu Wars. He sang Cornish mining tunes. He lent his men some of his own brave heart. And here came the attackers, 3 human wave attacks, all of them beaten off with very light friendly casualties, a few wounded, that was it. And they stopped the enemy dead in their tracks. Rick Rescorla received a Silver Star for his actions that night. When the fight was over on the 3rd day, the 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry was pulled back, and Rescorla's company went with them back to the rear to get a cold beer and a hot shower and something to eat for the first time in a couple of days. And his battalion marched out of that clearing toward another one 3 miles away and walked straight into a fresh North Vietnamese battalion set up in a hasty L-shaped ambush. And this was in triple canopy jungle with chest-high elephant grass, and 155 American boys were killed in 6 hours' time in that fight. They were calling for help, and Rescorla's company and his platoon were sent in on a high-risk nighttime helicopter landing in a hot landing zone. And Rescorla came in and looked around. He shouted out to the rather stunned survivors of that afternoon of fighting, "They've got us surrounded, boys. Good, good, good. We can attack in any goddamn direction we want." This was Rick Rescorla then, and he didn't change much. He came back from Vietnam, took his American citizenship, went to Oklahoma University Law School, got a law degree, taught law for a while at a college in South Carolina, went to work for Morgan Stanley as a security director, and these gentlemen can tell you more about what he did there. So let me throw it off to you. But I would tell you Hal Moore, General Hal Moore, my best friend, captain in battle and co-author, said that Rick Rescorla was the finest infantry platoon leader he ever saw, and he was a pretty goddamn good one himself. So that tells you something.
Thanks, Joe. Bill, why don't you pick up the story?
Sure. He is pretty much what I remember with how Joe described him. But imagine he is this military individual trying to lead a bunch of civilians, okay, who at best may pay attention a little bit, but they got other things going on in their lives. So the reason I bring that up is I want to kind of start in 1993, prior to 2001, when the planes hit the building. So in 93 is when the first bomb went off in the building. They parked it down below, bomb goes off, okay, fills up the stairwells with smoke. The lights in the stairwells were all on the same grid as the entire building, so all the lights went out in the stairwell. So these people were walking down 70, 80, 90 flights of stairs, okay, to get out of there in the smoke and in the dark. And panic ensued, and it was a mess. Well, Rick Rescorla, the first thing he did was he got the building, the World Trade Center, to put the lights on a whole separate grid, fix the ventilation, because his biggest fear was that panic would ensue again if anything ever happened to that building. And by the way, Rick was convinced from the day I met him, which was actually in 1997, and I worked with him for about 4 years, he was convinced that that building was a target. And they weren't going to do it the same way the second time that they did the first time, but he wanted to make sure we were much more prepared this time. So what Rick had done was saved all our lives way before 9/11. There were about 2,600 of us in the building, and one of the things Rick had done was instill to us every single day that the primary objective you have is to get out of that building, period. There's going to be nobody to save you. There's no ladders that go high enough. There's no way that anybody's going to come up and get you. You have to get out yourself. And the one thing about Rick was he took it personally. Every single one of these people at our firm, he felt personally responsible for, because he was so convinced that there was going to be another attack on this building that he felt that he had the responsibility to make sure every single person got out of there safely. And that's all he focused on. You know, you kind of think about people who are head of security sometimes, and you sit there and go, well, they're worried about someone stealing a stapler and all that kind of stuff, right? That wasn't Rick. All Rick could think about, all Rick could talk to us about, was how do I prepare these civilians whose life is being on the phone all day long, who don't ever want to leave their desk, to get them to leave their desk on that day and get the hell out of the building. And that's all he ever talked about. And it's a little bit what Joe talked about in terms of him being able to see what was going to happen. He could see it in his mind's eye that this was a target, and it was just a matter of time. So we had evacuation drills probably once every 2 or 3 months, okay? And we had fire marshals on every floor, and we'd have to go through these kind of evacuation drills, and if we'd go to one of the stairwells, and if that stairwell was blocked, we had to know where the other stairwells were, and go through this over and over and over again, and we're all like, this guy's kind of crazy, okay? Making us do this stuff over and over and over again. But he wasn't. He knew exactly what was going to happen. And so for us, okay, on that day when it happened, all we thought about was getting out of the building. And so for me, I was down on the 44th floor at the time the second plane hit, and literally blew out all the elevator bays, and there was stuff falling on the ground, and people got knocked down, all that kind of stuff. But as soon as that stopped, you could hear Rick's bullhorn. Everybody stay calm. Just keep walking down the stairs. Just keep moving, right? And so for all of us at the time, that's kind of what we remember. And I'll tell you why it made a difference too, and in this preparedness. And I'm going to turn it over to Bill here in a second, because he has a story that I think will resonate with all of you. We trained about 250 to 300 people every month, approximately month and a half, in New York to become stockbrokers. So we'd fly in from all over the country, and in many cases, for most of these people, it's their very first time in New York City, and probably the very first time in the World Trade Center. And training was up on, I think, the 60th floor, is that right? 61st floor?
61.
61st floor, okay? It's their second day, okay, in New York, okay? They hadn't been through any of this training. They didn't know what to do, but there was one person who had, and that was Bill. And Bill had been through it, and Bill knew exactly what to do. And that changed the lives of those 270 people who had never, ever been in that building before and had no idea what to do to get him out of that building safe because of what Rick Rescorla taught Bill what to do. So I'm going to turn it over to Bill.
Well, thanks, Bill. And good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure and honor to meet all of you. Everything Bill just said is so vivid in my memory, just hearing it again, and just remembering that day, and really how quickly things came to pass, and how quickly you had to be decisive and take action. It all was because of Rick's amazing ability to train and lead. My story in the Trade Center is, I had worked there only a year. Ironically enough, I had started September 11th of 2000. That was my first official day of working there. And I counted in my mind the other night, I think 4 or 5 different occasions where we would have really emergency drills and fire drills. And Rick was responsible for setting those up and coordinating them. And the story that I always remember, because it was so prevalent, every Morgan Stanley employee would tell it, was in '93, to what Bill was saying before, when the bombing took place, it took 2 hours to get down the stairwell because there was just so many people to put here and get them out in a timely fashion. And I always thought that, and then going to the drills that Rick ran, first of all, when you heard Rick's voice, he immediately just had your attention. Some of the people that Bill were mentoring before that have limited attention span, well, I'm one of those civilians with a limited attention span. But when Rick Rescorla spoke, he immediately grabbed your attention. And everything that he said during these drills always stuck in the back of my mind, which is 2 hours, it took time, you've got to be quick, you've got to take decisive action, leave, take the stairwell, and get out quickly. You want to get out of the building. It just, you don't realize what you learn until, unfortunately, sometimes you have to put it into action and put it into place. So on that particular day, I'll never forget, coming in about 6:30 in the morning for a class that was supposed to start at 7:30, and I remember walking across the street that day from my apartment, which was directly across from there, and saying, what a beautiful day. It's going to be a great day, second day of training. I was so excited for the agenda that we had in place. And this class of 276 people reported directly to me, and I was going to make this an unforgettable and great experience for them. I was so excited. And, we had our first speaker come in. He actually, ironically, finished 15 minutes early, which was so important to us because after I'd put everybody on break, I remember a few minutes later, somebody comes running into me and they said, Bill, something happened in one of our rooms. There seems to be some type of explosion or something that happened in one of the adjacent buildings, and there's a crack in the window. So I said, let me go see this. So I went and I looked, and there was indeed a crack, in what was very thick glass and windows. And I could see a faint image of something that had happened in Building 1. And I go, all right, let me get back to the main room and try to regroup everybody that I have. Now, when I'd put people on break, some of them have decided to go downstairs. A lot of people just wanted to hang out, okay, and go to the room. So my job, at least in my mind, get everybody centered into one room and get them ready for the decision. And I remember we got back in there, and almost immediately I said to myself, once everybody was organized, I said, you know what, I don't know what's going on, and I have no idea, but I do know what I've learned thanks to the training that Rick and his team put in place. You know what, let's open up the stairwells and let's get everybody out of here. I think it makes a great, or it would be the right thing to do, because you know, obviously you can always come back to a location, you can't always leave it. So for me, I said, let's do this. And remembering the 2 hours it took to get down the stairwell, I wanted to make sure we did this as quickly as possible. So we opened up the stairwell, sure enough, got everybody out, okay, and started evacuating. We get to about the 50th floor, and actually at that point, there was an announcement made to that Building 1 had been hit by an aircraft, and Building 2 is secure for now to go back to your desks. And I just remember, again, all the training that we had and all the evacuations drills, I said, I'm not going back. I said, you know, let's just keep going down the stairs. And sure enough, maybe about 120 seconds after that announcement, we were hit by the plane. And the plane hit the building. And, you know, when you were inside of the Trade Center that day, okay, and you were in the stairwell, when the plane hit, it was almost like you were on a giant pendulum, and the pendulum just went from one direction to the other. You felt like you were going to fall out of the building. But the building took the impact, and we just continued to go down the stairwells. And I remember we got to about the 8th floor, which was the old observatory deck that we had there. And we were getting on the escalators, and I could hear Rick, because, again, you remembered his voice. And you just remembered what he sounded like, and I could hear him doing a lot of what you said, which was really telling people to continue to leave, get out of the building, and everything else. At one point, I think he was singing, okay, a song. I didn't know what it was, but he was singing something and just trying to keep people motivated and happy. And, you know, once we got out of that building, you know, I remember saying, wow, you know, I don't know what's going on, but thank God at least we've gotten, I believe, everybody out from the floor. You know, I remember having a group of people with me and going over to a police officer and saying, you know, I've got this group of people I'm responsible for. What do I do? And the officer said, honestly, he goes, get out of downtown. He goes, we heard there's another plane coming. And I didn't know if that was the plane that crashed ultimately in Pennsylvania or the one that was headed to the Pentagon. I didn't know. But we took the group and we continued to walk. And I remember maybe being about 10, 12 minutes away from the building when you felt this loud rumble, or you really heard and felt this loud rumble. And the ground moved from underneath you, and you began to see that building come down. And it was really something that I still to this day could never even really explain to you what type of feeling that was. But I remember saying to myself, you know, we've got all these folks in from out of town, and what would Rick do, okay, as the head of security? He would make sure that he followed through on his job. So I remember walking back to Midtown Manhattan and trying to organize all the people that we had that I was accountable for. And it took several days, but working with the hotels and working with the teams and everybody else, when I finally checked off the 276th name of the person in the one class that we were looking for, I felt incredible relief at that point, knowing that we were fortunate and lucky to have everybody out. But, you know, I always think back, and now I look at my life, and Bill, you had said this point before, how many people were affected by loved ones that didn't get out of the building. And that's always going to be heartbreaking and something really difficult to think about for me. But then I think about the lives that were impacted by Rick and the training that he provided us and the wisdom that he imparted upon us to make the right decision when you needed to do so. And I thank him. As I look at my 5-month-old child today, okay, my second one, I thank him because he certainly impacted my life in a positive way and in a positive way for all the other folks that I was responsible for. So,
let me finish the story with Rick.
Right. I was.
So this is Rick in his typical form. okay? Everybody got out of the building, at least that he could tell. And he said, I'm going to go in now and sweep every floor to make sure that we got everybody. Well, when he went back into that building is when the building collapsed. And that's when Rick died. So out of the 12 people that died, 10 of them were security guards who worked with Rick, which would make sense, right? Because he instilled that with them the same bravery that he had. And these were kind of part-time guards, but they stayed with him, okay, in that building. And the 2 other were civilians. I knew them both, and both of them chose not to leave the building because, as Billy had said, the last time in the 93 bombing, had you waited 2 or 3 hours and let everybody get out, then you could have just walked down nice and casually and left the building. So they decided that they would wait for that to happen. So what Rick was going to do, I am sure, was go up to those floors, sweep the floors, and find them. And if he found them, grab him by the shirt collar, okay, and drag him out of the building. Well, I have no doubt that's what he would have done. But that's what he went in to do. So that's how it ended, with Rick going back one more time to make sure that he got everybody out of that building.
Bill, let me ask you, how long after the event did you learn about Rick?
I'm not quite sure what do you mean?
How long after the event did you learn that Rick did not survive?
Oh, that Rick didn't survive. Oh, we knew probably. So we went, we had a command center that was, so the World Trade Center's downtown. So it's right at the tip of Manhattan. And our command center was up in Midtown. So for me at the time, we got out, we got about 4 or 5 blocks away. To Billy's point, we heard the rumbling, went inside another building, 2 buildings go down. We come back out, and there must be this gray dust about this deep. And you're walking through the gray dust and all this stuff, kind of working your way up to Midtown. When we got up to Midtown, we'd already set up kind of our command center to try to figure out where everybody was. Well, the one person that you would need to help figure that out was Rick. And Rick wasn't there. And we couldn't get a hold of Rick. We didn't know where Rick was, right? And we came to find out, I don't know if it was later that day or the next day, that Rick actually went back into the building. But there was a real kind of just absence of him not being there. Because he was the guy that, through it all, would remain completely calm, okay, and say, this is what we're going to do, here's where we're going to go. We didn't have that. We didn't have him now, right? And so it was that kind of absence that you felt when we were at that command center and he wasn't there with that loud voice and telling us what we should be doing right now. So that's probably more, that's when we really started to first recognize that he wasn't there.
I knew that he was dead when I heard that the South Tower had collapsed, because I knew he was up there clearing those floors looking for his 10 security guards. They were his people. He was going to get them out if he could. That's just Rick. That's how he was going to operate. Sad, sad, sad to lose such a guy. But I will tell you, you know, there's always the story behind the story. 3 years before 9/11, Rick Rescorla was diagnosed with metastatic prostate cancer, and the doctor told him he only had 6 months to live. But Rick somehow knew he had another job to do. He had told some of us after that diagnosis that whatever happened, he did not want to die in a hospital bed or a nursing home bed with somebody changing his Pampers. That if there was any way possible, by God, he would go out better than that. And so he did. So he did.
Billy, I know there's been some effort to memorialize Rick. Can you speak to that, of some of the things that have happened?
Well, I know just recently, we had discussed this on the way here. I remember watching the president address on 9/11, a group of people outside, and he had said that this year, Rick Rescorla, okay, from Morgan Stanley, will be honored with the Presidential Citizenship Award. And if I'm not mistaken, I think that's one of the highest, either first or second highest. Second highest award that you could be awarded with in this country. And for me, I think, wow, I applaud the president for doing that. And I also think it's long overdue, okay, that he's recognized, okay, for exactly what he did.
And you said that's going to be on November the 7th.
November 7th at the White House in the afternoon. I would add that a number of us tried our best to get him the Presidential Medal of Freedom when George Bush was in the White House. We had a petition going with 75,000 signatures, and we just couldn't make any headway against the goddamn politicians.
I've never heard that before.
Yeah, me either. That's a new one.
Well, Joe, as a journalist, could you kind of sum up in your mind who Rick Rescorla was and what made him the person he was?
Rick Rescorla never changed. He was passionate. He was a leader. He was meant for combat. I have to tell you a story. He led a small patrol. He liked to do that before the Iadrang, and I don't know, he had maybe a dozen guys with him, and they're kind of sweeping a small village up in the mountains. And there's a hooch there, and Rick, leading the way, throws open the door and walks in, and sitting around the table are about 8 Viet Cong and North Vietnamese officers in the middle of a conference. And Rick, he just sort of says, "Excuse me," and backed out. And then they ran like hell down the mountain because there were a lot of bad guys after him. He was always looking for something to do, some trouble to get into. What can I say? Just, if you had him as your platoon leader, you're gonna survive. You're gonna make it. Yeah. And if you die, by God, you'll die doing something big and bold and important. And that was Rick Rescorla. From his first days, he was in Rhodesia with the Territorials, and then he was a London Bobby on the police force. And he looked around, and we had the only war going. So he gets on a plane and comes to America and enlists in the U.S. Army, and immediately is chosen as the best guy in basic and the best guy in advanced training, and then he's chosen to go to OCS, and he's the best guy in OCS. A real leader of men. What can I say?
Either of you have any last comments before we open up for questions and answers here?
Well, for us, it wasn't, it wasn't warfare for him, but it was life or death for him with us. And to show you how serious it was, we used to do, as I said, these evacuation drills. And so you imagine we'd have 60 or 70 people on one floor, all on the phones, all talking to people, and it's now time for the evacuation drill. So when you do an evacuation drill, you'd have 2 fire marshals. They'd have to wear a little red hat, okay, and they had to wear their little kind of reflective, like, vest thing, right? So you knew who they were. And then their job was to sweep the floor and get everybody to come to one of the 4 stairwells, because there's one on each quarter of the building that would take you downstairs. So in many cases, you know, it would be one of the more junior people on the floor, right? And they'd go around and they'd try to get these people to get off the phone and go, and the people wouldn't pay attention to them and stuff. But your biggest fear was, here's what Rick would do. He'd come up on the floor, okay? And when he came up on the floor, by God, you better be off that phone, because he'll come in, he'll take the phone out of your hand and hang it up and grab you and take you to the stairwell, right? And you're like, this guy's crazy, right? But that's what he did. So he lived it every day. And it was just that force of personality, you know, that Joe talks about, that for us was the person that saved our lives.
I echo everything Bill said. I think just in the few times that I interacted with Rick, I think pleasant man, but he was there to save your life. And exactly what Bill said is exactly what I could see him having done, which was, okay, I don't really care, okay, if you're happy with this or not. I'm here to save your life, and this is what I'm going to do. Yeah. And you know, when I think about that, and I think about all of the lives, again, that he impacted in such a positive way, being that way and being who he was, I mean, he'll have my gratitude eternally. And I'm grateful that my path crossed with his, and he was the person that was the head of our security on that day, because he truly made a difference, not only in my life, but in so many other people's.
Thank you. We have some time for questions and answers. If anyone would like to ask a question, the 2 mics are here on the staircase.
Mics are on each end.
There's one person walking to the mic, I assume.
Good afternoon, gentlemen.
Good afternoon.
My name is Wyatt Lothry. I'm from Kansas State University, so Little Apple, Manhattan, Kansas. So you guys are talking about 9/11. Honestly, our generation doesn't really even remember 9/11, let alone even know what 9/11 was when it happened. So you talk about a hero all the time, and you talk about a lot of his leadership characteristics. What leadership characteristics have you guys applied into your lives that has really helped you guys?
Well, I can tell you, I think this is my 24th year at Morgan Stanley, and 15 of them, or 16, I don't know, I'm probably dating myself now, but a lot of them were spent in management. And really what you learn, or what I think I've learned working with people, is clear communication is key. They taught us a long time ago in one of our management training courses, you can never really over-communicate to folks. So when you're in charge of something, make sure you have regular, clear communication. Make sure the message that you're delivering is consistent. And ironically enough, Morgan Stanley actually sent us to West Point recently, about 2 years ago, to spend time with a lot of folks on really leadership development and training. And one of what we learned, and I'm sure you all know this, I'm preaching to the choir, I learned something called the AAR, which is the After Action Review. When you implement a plan and you put it in place, looking back on it and seeing, you know, after a finite period of time, what went right, what went wrong. To me, that's something I've just recently adapted into my management style, and I just love it. But, you know, being clear, communicating, always thinking of what's in the best interest of the people that you have working for you, and putting a plan in place and executing it, and then looking back on it afterwards to see what you could have done better or worse.
Yeah, I'll just add to that real quick. It's a little bit, I kind of view it as the servant leader, right? And that's what Rick was. And it, to me, you know, he would always be the last one to eat. He would be the last one to walk out of the building. He'd be the last one, because that's what leaders do. And, you know, to Billy's point with communication, right? They won't care what you have to say as a leader unless they know how much you care as a leader.
Right.
Okay? And so, you know, to me, I see too many leaders get caught up in this idea of the ego-ness of being a leader, right? Versus really understanding that it's serving people. And that's, if there's one thing I took away from Rick, it was his belief in serving people. He was there to serve us, right? And he looked at that every day, so.
And I'll chime in and tell you that it's been my great good fortune in a very long life to go to and survive half a dozen of our wars and a few that didn't belong to us, but I went to anyway. And I got to go into battle, into war, standing alongside some of the finest combat leaders that we had in this country. Hal Moore as a battalion commander in the Iadrang Valley. Instinctive commander who was thinking ahead of the enemy commander by about 10 minutes. And I would watch him move a company into a gap 5 minutes before the enemy attacked that very quadrant of the perimeter. I went to the Persian Gulf War and ran into an old friend that I first met when he was a brand new major in the U.S. Army, a guy named H. Norman Schwarzkopf. And I spent a few days with him on the eve of the Gulf War. And he told me, he said, "Joe, I know you want to go with the 1st Cav, but they're in my Central Reserve, and they may not get a piece of this thing. It's going to be over with pretty quick." He said, "I'm going to send you to the division that has the most challenging and dangerous mission in my battle plan, and to the commander I have over here who is most like General Hal Moore." And he sent me off to the 24th Infantry Division Mechanized to make a 250-mile charge across the western Iraq desert under the command, and I was in the back pocket of a guy named Barry McCaffrey. And so I've gotten to see great combat leadership in action. And the other thing that goes along with that is timing is everything. On September 10th, 2001, 24 hours before 9/11, I was sworn into government service as a special consultant to General Colin Powell at the State Department, and I was standing in line at the badge office when they flew the plane into the Pentagon, and let me tell you, that next year was really interesting. So.
Thank you very much, gentlemen.
We have time
Thank
for
you.
one more question. Do you have a question, ma'am?
It's such an honor to be here and listening to this. I was actually telling the story of Rick Rescorla to the shuttle driver on my way over here and how he sang and the leadership that he got from Hal Moore, who always said, "Leave no soldier behind," and how he carried that forward. So from the aspect of being executives, when you look back on someone who affected you at this level, at this time in life, what is your story going forward in terms of leadership?
That's a great question. You know, I don't know that I can add a lot more to what I had said about being a servant leader. I mean, I look at my children now that, you know, and they were in grade school when 9/11 happened. And in our town, we lost about, I think, 19 or 20 people in the World Trade Center. And, you know, for me, what I like to be able to do is impart on my children kind of this story of Rick Rescorla and the story of kind of how he viewed leadership and how he viewed, you know, just taking it all so personally, right? It was just personal to him. Every day it was personal to him. And I think that if I were to say, you know, the real true leaders are the people that take it personally, right? They really, really, truly care about every single person in their charge. And I mean, to his core, that's who he was. And if I were to say, to me, as you know, as a leader and the number of people I managed probably close to, I guess 8,000 or 9,000 people. Okay, at the end, and it's hard to get to know every single one of them, right? That's a lot of time. Okay, but at the end of the day, you still care about every single one of them, and you want to try to make a difference in their lives. And Rick made the ultimate difference in my life. Okay, I'm sitting here today because of what he did. Okay, so you know, to me, it's just deeply caring for the people that you're responsible for.
Thanks, Bill.
Yeah.
We've got one more question over here. This will be our last question.
Don't remember in America on September 11 how united and loving and powerful it was in spite of everything. For example, I went to the grocery store crying and looked at everybody. Everybody was crying, and we instantly hugged, never said a word, don't know the names of the people. And do you have any stories like that, just to show them how united we can be, how we can act as one and come together in spite of all our differences?
Well, I appreciate everything you said, because I've been saying that ever since that day. And to me, I can never say, quite frankly, anything good came from September 11th, because too many people lost too many loved ones and were impacted by it. But what I can say is something inspirational that's stayed with me since that day happened, and exactly what you said, which is, you know, people came together, and it was one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen. And there was no thought of race, religion, or anything else that unfortunately divides us. You know, I think there's an old saying, you guys may know this, there's no atheists in a foxhole. Well, you know, on 9/11, okay, there were no differences in people. You know, everybody banded together. I remember going down the stairwell, and really people who were having a difficult time getting down the stairwell. I remember helping a couple of people that were a little bit overweight, having a difficult time going down 61 flights of stairs. And I did not care what that person looked like or what their religion was or anything really about them, other than looking at them and saying, that's another human being that needs my help right now. And I'm going to help them and make sure that happens. And I remember going back to the hotel to try to begin to formulate how I'm going to account for all of these people. And the folks at the hotel were so wonderful to me in setting me up in a command center and helping me out and taking a time away from their business day and not caring about it. So at that point, it wasn't about money or it wasn't about anything other than people need help on that day and are there. And real quick story just to end it. The hotel I stayed in, actually behind that hotel, there was a chapel, and the chapel had a firehouse with a chapel that was associated with it. So I remember coming out, it's about 1:30 in the morning on September 12th, and I had gone downstairs just to really get a breath of fresh air and try to compose myself. And I remember walking around and looking and seeing what was a fire truck that I imagined when it pulled out of the fire station was beautiful and brand new and red and looked unbelievable. And then looking at it and seeing it really crushed and compressed and covered in dust. And it turns out that particular firehouse, Father Michael Judge was the priest that was unfortunately killed by a falling body, okay, on 9/11. And that firehouse was really impacted by people that did not make it out alive. But I remember looking in the back of that fire truck and looking in the dust, and somebody had etched in God bless America. And that stayed with me my whole life because I said, America today, okay, really became united. And because of people like Rick and the sacrifices that they made, to me, that will stay with me for the rest of my days.
Let us all show our appreciation.